Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, November 13th, 2023. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for joining us. We are 4 days away from the deadline to avert a government shutdown. House Speaker Mike Johnson has introduced a plan to split government funding into two smaller parts, with some federal programs running out of funding on January 19th and others on February 2nd. But just how viable is that approach? And would something like that pass the Senate? We'll hear from members coming up. The Supreme Court has adopted a formal ethics code for the first time in its history. The court said in a statement that the code closely follows with an existing code of conduct for lower courts, but has been adapted to the, quote, unique institutional setting of the Supreme Court. We'll hear what Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin, a longtime supporter of Supreme Court ethics, has to say about it. And we'll get you ready for Episode 9 of Books That Shaped America, the 1980 bestseller Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. The book strongly argues for free trade, lower taxes, limited government regulation, and school choice. And in our companion podcast, a conversation with his friend Chapman University professor Mark Skousen. That is coming up. We begin on Capitol Hill. Here's Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer on government funding.
It's a critical week here in the U.S. Capitol. This Friday at midnight, the federal government is going to shut down unless Congress acts first. The last thing the American people want to see is another unnecessary and painful government shutdown. Democrats certainly don't want to have a shutdown. And many of our Republican colleagues have likewise claimed they don't want to see one either. Even the mere act of approaching a shutdown is damaging. Last Friday, when Moody's announced they lowered the U.S. credit rating to negative, citing continued political polarization as one of its reasons, that proved to be true. The answer for avoiding a government shutdown is what I've been saying all along. Bipartisanship is necessary. I've said on multiple occasions that if we're going to work together to keep the government open, Speaker Johnson will have to avoid pushing steep cuts or poison pills that Democrats can't support. For now, I am pleased that Speaker Johnson seems to be moving in our direction by advancing a CR that does not include the highly partisan cuts that Democrats have warned against. The Speaker's proposal is far from perfect, but the most important thing is that it refrains from making steep cuts while also extending funding for defense in the second tranche of bills in February, not the first in January. Today, the House Rules Committee will take up the Speaker's bill, and that will give us the first indication of how committed Republicans are to keeping the government open. The next few days will tell all in the House, and I hope the Speaker does not buckle to the loud voices on his hard right flank to add partisan cuts as the price for keeping the government open. In divided government, extremists on one side cannot expect to dictate the agenda for the rest of Congress, especially when their views are so out of line with the majority of Congress and the majority of the American people. I hope Speaker Johnson recognizes that he will need support from Democrats in both chambers if he wants to avoid causing a shutdown. He needs to stay away from poison pills and steep hard right cuts for that to happen.
And the Hill.com writing today that it's, quote, very unclear if a tiered government funding plan could pass both the House and Senate. Top Democrats oppose the plan, and it is already causing disagreements among Republicans. Johnson can only afford a few defections among House Republicans, and in the Senate, some GOP lawmakers would prefer not to drag the fight into next year. That's from the article on thehill.com. Here's Republican leader Mitch McConnell speaking about government funding.
Now, on an entirely different matter, I've been encouraged this year by the progress our Appropriations Committee has made toward restoring regular order to the way we fund the federal government. As I've said before, shutting down the government does nothing to advance that work. Regular order requires that Congress provide itself the time for careful consideration and thorough amendment. I'm glad to see that Speaker Johnson has produced a continuing resolution that would do exactly that. There's a lot of work left to do, aside from the remaining full-year appropriation bills. Glaring national security priorities continue to demand our attention, from Israel to Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific and, of course, our southern border. House Republicans have produced a responsible measure that will keep the lights on, avoid a harmful lapse in government funding, and provide the time and space to finish that important work. I'll support their continuing resolution and encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Part of Leader Time remarks from Republican Senator Mitch McConnell and Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer. Now, over on the House side, at least one member of the Democratic leadership is skeptical of Speaker Johnson's tiered approach. It's Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar, who spoke about it on MSNBC this morning.
Well, it seems to us that two steps means two opportunities for them to shut down the government in the future. that kind of seems
okay.
That's kind of their plan here. But we're still trying to figure this out and where they want to go. But we have been very clear that we don't want steep cuts in government funding, and we don't want to criminalize abortion care. And those, they have done all of those in their appropriations bills. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, and that's what they have done each and every time. So for them to step back, this is a new strategy because they're continuing to fight themselves within that room on where they go and how they fund government.
Can you see a way forward with, especially Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House? Is there a way to negotiate and avoid a shutdown?
Well, we hope so. But we know that it's going to take both parties. We know it's going to be Democrats and Republicans who are going to avert a shutdown. That's always been the case. That was the case weeks ago before Republicans got rid of the last speaker. By the way, one of those things, one of the cardinal sins that the far right had said, the extreme right had said, is that he passed a continuing resolution with Democratic votes. It's always going to take Democratic votes to fund government. The sooner that our Republican colleagues work with us on these issues, the better off we'll all be. It takes them a little while to get there, though.
Meanwhile, Georgia Republican Austin Scott said he supports Speaker Johnson's approach. He talked about it with fellow Republican Representative Mark Alford's radio show in Kansas City.
What do you say to some of those in America, some in my district, who say, shut it down. Let's shut it down. I'm so sick of these CRs. Let's just shut it down and we'll deal with it.
Yeah. No, it's I hear them. I get the same thing in my district. It's frustration that is coming from the American citizens that is well founded in the frustration. But the consequences of a shutdown are much worse than the consequences of giving us some time to negotiate with the Senate. The Democrats control the House. The Democrats control the Senate. Mm-hmm. The Democrats control the White House. Mm-hmm. We as Republicans in the House, where we have the influence, have got to have some time to give our Speaker an ability to negotiate with the Senate on what we are and what we're not going to fund. And I would remind you, Mark, it's not just about the total dollars that are being spent. It's about what those dollars are being spent on. Gotcha. So we've got a good Speaker of the House. We've got the opportunity to do some things and do them the right way. The cuts won't be as big as I think most people that are Republicans would like for them to have. We're very concerned about the deficit, as everybody should be. But we have to make continual progress, and continual progress, just by definition, requires us in the House to negotiate with the Senate Republicans and the Senate Democrats and the White House and House Democrats to get to a middle-of-the-road solution that keeps our economy moving in the right direction.
And what's the White House's view? Here's Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
So we're going to let the negotiations continue. We're going to be in close contact with Democrats in both the House and the Senate, the leadership there, and make sure that they are having their conversations to see the best path forward for the American people. And that's what the president spoke to. I think he said there was going to be a conversation happening later this afternoon, or pretty much very soon. And so we're just going to let that be.
Thanks, Karine. So the House plan includes no aid to Israel or Ukraine. Is the White House still confident that their supplemental funding request can pass on its own? And what vehicles remain here for Ukraine funding?
So look, Jake spoke about this very well from here and talked about the importance of making sure that we continue to fund Ukraine, making sure that we have funding for Israel as well. I'm not going to get into legislative negotiations from here, from the podium, but look, I'm going to be very clear. Lives are at stake, right? The national security supplemental that we put forward is incredibly important. It's important for our national security. Also, let's not forget the domestic supplemental as well. So it's important for our needs here, our needs across the globe. And so, look, we're going to not negotiate from here, but I think Jake laid it out very clearly, the importance of continuing to fund Ukraine and the importance of the funding that we've asked for Israel.
You've called the latter CR unserious. What deal would the White House be willing to accept, given all the stakes you laid out?
So, look, I mean, let's be very clear here. I know there's been a lot of questions on this and the supplemental. Look, House Republicans are threatening a government shutdown. That's what we're seeing right now. That would hurt our economy. That would hurt our national security, as I just spoke to. And in September, we saw this happen, where House Republicans threatened to shut down the government unless they got their radical demands. Then they shut down Congress for three chaotic weeks as they try to figure out who their next speaker was going to be after ousting the last speaker. And so, look, there's work to be done. They have to get the work done. They got to keep the government open.
And for more details on Speaker Johnson's bill, here's Politico budget and appropriations reporter Caitlin Emma.
He's essentially proposing funding a part of the government through January 19th, and then the rest of the government, including the Pentagon, all the biggest domestic programs, into early February. So he's setting up this two-tiered sort of stopgap funding system to avoid a shutdown in at the end of the week, basically. November 17th at midnight, federal funding expires. But this is a clean, so-called clean CR. It doesn't include any spending cuts that the Freedom Caucus wanted. It includes, an extension of the Farm Bill through September 2024. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a good outcome for Democrats, who are sort of, some are coming out against this idea of this two-step thing. But some of them are holding their fire and sort of saying that they're reviewing it, and it'll be interesting to see where Democrats shake out on this particular idea.
And what about conservative Republicans? How do they feel about it?
Well, we've already seen some early pushback from conservatives, Congressman Chip Roy, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Warren Davidson, several folks who are known as being particular hardliners are saying this is unacceptable. There are no spending cuts included. This doesn't do what the Freedom Caucus had hoped. Essentially it is similar to what Kevin McCarthy, paired up with Democrats to pass and then, lost his speaker's gavel. It's sort of the same situation, Saying that, I'm not saying that Speaker Johnson is in trouble. He definitely has more trust within the Republican conference right now, but it is a similar scenario. So I do expect to see more pushback from conservatives.
So what's the timeline? When does it hit the floor? When are we going to see votes on it?
The Rules Committee meets this afternoon to essentially prep it for floor debate. So that will be interesting to watch, just because you have, a couple conservatives on that panel who will have to, either vote for or against putting this on the floor. So, for example, Mr. Roy is on the Rules panel. The House is gearing up for a vote tomorrow, Tuesday. So it'll be really, really interesting to see who supports this. Again, we saw over the weekend House Appropriations Ranking Member Rosa DeLauro come out as, saying that this is a bad idea. She doesn't approve of this sort of two-step process. She's upset about the fact that it doesn't include any emergency funding for Israel or Ukraine. But I think maybe Speaker Johnson is definitely going to need Democratic help to pass this, and it's possible that he could get that, but it sort of will be interesting to watch, who in the Republican conference, who among Democrats will support this.
And do you have a sense as to whether or not this is going to pass, or not yet?
Not yet. I mean, it is, like I said, sort of the best case scenario for Democrats. The other week he introduced an Israel aid bill that made that funding conditional on cuts to the IRS. Democrats saw that as sort of picking a fight. Why would you condition something as important as Israel aid on cutting funding for, the IRS enforcement. This is not that. This is not picking a fight with Democrats. The two-step idea, sure, is not particularly popular, but the funding deadlines that he's setting up here, January 19th and February 2nd, are only a couple weeks apart. So it's quite possible that a lot of Democrats support this.
There were problems with two GOP funding bills this last week. What happened? Explain why those were pulled.
Right. Well, when Speaker Johnson, took over for Mr. McCarthy, he made this promise to plow forward in passing a dozen, Republican appropriations bills. He had some initial success there on some of the easier bills, but as we've gotten, through the weeks, a lot of the problems that were plaguing Mr. McCarthy are now plaguing Speaker Johnson, and it's just that you have this, really unruly Republican conference that just can't coalesce around these bills. For example, the transportation housing bill was supposed to come up for a vote the other week. They had to pull it because you had, members who sit in and around sort of the Amtrak's Northeast corridor saying that they, just couldn't stomach like $1 billion in funding cuts for Amtrak. On the other hand, you had conservatives saying that they want to get rid of Amtrak altogether. So you had somebody like Congressman Tom Cole, who oversees that bill, saying like, I've got 8 or 10 members on both sides telling me they don't want to support this, and I have to get the 2 of them to vote for this bill. So those problems are still, in existence. The financial services bill last week, which is typically not a very controversial bill, ended up kind of falling apart because you had Democrats saying, or you had conservatives saying, this includes GSA in this bill, and GSA is going to fund a new FBI headquarters, and we can't have that. Or there was a DC-related abortion issue that moderates had a hard time with. So it really speaks to Speaker Johnson's challenge, where you just have so many members in different factions of the conference that can't support some of these bills. And it's not going to get easier, this idea of passing these 12 bills, which will never become law, by the way. It's not going to get any easier for him.
Politico budget and appropriations reporter Caitlin Emma. You can see the entire segment at cspan.org/Washington Journal and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. And that Rules Committee hearing she referred to is happening now. Also today, for the first time in its history, the Supreme Court announced it has adopted a formal code of ethics. NBCnews.com writing that the 14-page document includes, quote, 5 canons of conduct on issues such as when justices should recuse themselves and what kind of outside activities they can engage in. In a statement signed by all 9 justices, reads like this, quote, the undersigned justices are promulgating this code of conduct to set out succinctly and gather in one place the ethics rules and principles that guide the conduct of the members of the court. The statement goes on to say that most of the code's rules are outlined are not themselves new, but the lack of a published code, quote, has led in recent years to the misunderstanding that the justices of this court, unlike all other jurists in this country, regard themselves as unrestricted by any ethics rules. Now, the code is based on rules followed by lower court judges and, among other things, requires justices to, quote, uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary and avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. Notably left out of the code, how it would be enforced and how it would work. And in their statement, the justices also acknowledged they had more work to do, including on financial disclosures. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin of Illinois is a longtime supporter of a Supreme Court Code of Conduct. He spoke about it earlier this afternoon on the Senate floor.
Today, for the first time in the history of the United States, the Supreme Court has issued a Code of Conduct for Supreme Court justices. Most Americans will be surprised to learn that this was the first time this Code of Conduct has been issued, but that's a fact. I know this issue better than most because 11 years ago, I wrote to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, along with several of my colleagues, and told him this establishment of a code of conduct for the Supreme Court justices was long overdue. After years of refusing to act, a series of scandalous disclosures involving several justices on the court, and the Senate Judiciary Committee passing legislation sponsored by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on ethical reform, the Supreme Court has finally responded. Today, for the first time in history, the Supreme Court of the United States is at least saying to the American people, we hear you. And understand that the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are members of a democratic form of government, not royalty, and that they should be held accountable as all public servants in the federal government are held accountable. At a glance, this code of conduct for justices of the Supreme Court is similar to the standards that apply to all other lower court federal judges. The court's code of conduct sets forth several important canons of conduct, including canons on upholding the integrity and independence of the judiciary and avoiding impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. All of these are important steps, but they fall short of what we could and should expect when a Supreme Court issues a code of conduct. The court's statement on the code specifically notes, and I quote, "For the most part, these rules and principles are not new," end of quote. That's a problem, because the court's previous practices were plainly inadequate. The court's new code of conduct does not appear to contain any meaningful enforcement mechanism to hold justices accountable for any violations of the code. It also leaves a wide range of decisions up to the discretion of individual justices, including decisions on recusal from sitting on cases. I'm still reviewing the court's new code of conduct. For now, I will note that the court's adoption of this code marks a step in the right direction. It may fall short of the ethical standards which other federal judges are held to, and that's unacceptable. And if it falls short, the American people will ultimately have the last word, and the integrity of the court is at issue. We are going to carefully review this proposed code of conduct to evaluate whether it complies with our goal that the highest court in the land not languish with the lowest standard of ethics in our federal government. But this release today, long overdue, begins a dialogue which could end in restoring the integrity of the court, and that is long overdue.
Senate Judiciary Chair Dick Durbin on the new code of conduct announced today by the Supreme Court. You're listening to Washington Today.
Hello, fans of the weekly podcast. Shannon, Rachel, and I want to hear from you. Have you wondered how I choose my clips? Or maybe you've wondered how I follow historical threads to examine, digging deep into the C-SPAN video library for gems that shed light on today's news. I want to answer all your questions in a special episode of the weekly podcast. Call 202-626-4600. That's 202-626-4600, and leave your name and question or comment about the weekly podcast. Or email us at podcasts@cspan.org. That's podcast with a plural S at cspan.org. We want to hear from you by November 15th. That's right, the beginning of hunting season. Thanks for making the weekly podcast one of C-SPAN Radio's top 10 podcasts. Again, write this number down, 202-626-4600, and leave your questions and comments.
People often think C-SPAN is funded by the federal government. In fact, we're a nonprofit organization that receives no government funding. As news consumption changes, you can help ensure the future of C-SPAN's unfiltered coverage of national government and politics. We hope you will consider making a tax-deductible contribution that will support our daily editorial operations. To learn more, visit cspan.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked today about U.S. involvement in efforts to release Israeli hostages held by Hamas terrorists. He said among the hostages is a 3-year-old American child who lost both his parents in the October 7th attacks.
The United States continues to work round the clock to support efforts to rescue and reunite hostages held by Hamas with their families where they belong. This includes many young children, one of whom is a 3-year-old American citizen toddler, whose parents were tragically killed by Hamas on October 7th. This is a top priority for President Biden, for Vice President Harris, for Secretary Blinken, for me personally. We have all spoken with families of U.S. citizens who are being held hostage by Hamas and have raised this issue with all of our counterparts. This remains a paramount priority for us. Just yesterday, President Biden spoke with the Emir of Qatar to discuss the important efforts and the important negotiations ongoing to try to secure the release of the hostages being held by Hamas. And later today, here at the White House, I'll be meeting with some of the families of the Americans who are currently being held. The United States has also been leading efforts to increase the flow of life-saving, sustained humanitarian assistance, food, water, medicine, into Gaza. While we've made some progress, much more is urgently needed to alleviate suffering among the civilian population in Gaza. We're glad to see Israel take an important step in this direction last week, and we remain in active discussions with the Israeli government about the importance of tactical humanitarian pauses in the fighting, to permit civilians to depart areas of active hostilities, to increase the flow of aid, and to enable hostage releases. We continue to have discussions at all levels, including President Biden with Prime Minister Netanyahu, to urge Israel to continue taking every possible measure to protect civilians. The loss of a single innocent life is a tragedy, whether it's a Palestinian civilian, an Israeli civilian, or anyone else. And we grieve for every innocent who is lost. At the same time, we will continue to stand behind the proposition that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorist attacks. And with Hamas, as I've said, you're dealing with an organization that has come out publicly since October 7th and said that it intends to commit another October 7th and another one until Israel no longer exists. You have a leading spokesman from Hamas saying that the objective of the organization is a permanent state of war with Israel. That is the reality that Israel is confronting, and it's a reality that would be unacceptable for any nation.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan speaking at the White House earlier today, he added that the Israeli-Hamas war and the U.S. airstrikes targeting Iranian-backed groups in Syria are just two of the topics on the agenda for President Biden's meeting with China's President Xi Jinping in San Francisco later this week. You can see all of Jake Sullivan's statement at cspan.org. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser said National Guard troops will be assisting Metropolitan Police for tomorrow's March for Israel on the National Mall. More than 60,000 people are expected to attend the event. It was organized by the Jewish Federations of North America and Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations to, quote, be an opportunity to come together in solidarity with the people of Israel. Here's Mayor Bowser.
We expect a large gathering. We are paying attention to the numbers of buses that are coming that are, I think we can expect in the tens of thousands of people. So people who are coming, getting some familiarity with how to get around is going to be important. The organizers are setting up ways that people can be badged to enter. I understand they're calling it a march, but it's actually a rally. It's going to be static on the National Mall.
The event is scheduled to start at 1 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Former White House senior medical advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci was in Washington today talking about U.S. and global health security. This event was hosted and sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. Former NIH director talked about what he thinks the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic.
When I look back at what we've experienced through COVID, there are so many lessons that absolutely have to be drilled into our corporate memory and not forgotten, which we tend to do when we have a pandemic in the rearview mirror. The first thing these are very fresh in my mind. I just thought about the maybe 25 lessons that we learned from COVID, and I focused it down to 10. I want to mention just 2 or 3 of them this morning. The first is really when you're dealing with pandemics to expect the unexpected, because if you look at how we looked at COVID in the beginning, we as a global health community put it in the framework of our prior experiences. The one that was most important was influenza. So influenza comes in a big blast in a season, and then it just goes away. It's spread mostly by people who are symptomatic, not asymptomatic. It rarely spreads by aerosol, mostly by droplet. And then all of a sudden we had an outbreak that was evolving right before us, so that we know that the science and the knowledge that we were getting was a moving target. So when you're dealing with a pandemic that's a brand new outbreak, it may not be like every other outbreak that you experienced. And we really painfully learned that. Whenever in the history of outbreaks did we ever have an outbreak in which in the same outbreak we had multiple up to 6 or more variants? It was always 1918 pandemic flu. It goes up, comes back, goes away, and that's it. You know, one virus maybe changed a little, not going from the original ancestral strain to now the 10th variant out of Omicron, which is from the lineage of Omicron, not to mention Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and then Delta, which fooled us all. Those are the things that we've really got to learn. We've got to be flexible, and we've got to be humble.
Former White House senior medical advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci. According to the CDC, the U.S. was averaging more than 3,800 weekly COVID-19 hospitalizations by the end of October, but that was down 6% from the beginning of the month. You can see this entire event at cspan.org. The impact of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision on last week's elections was the topic at a Heritage Foundation event here in Washington. One of the speakers of the event was Virginia Republican Representative Bob Good. He talked about mobilizing voters around the access to reproductive care with Eric Baptist, senior counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Since we're a few blocks away from the Supreme Court, I kind of want to go back to the Dobbs decision, which was issued just over a year ago. And the promise of Dobbs. It was the promise to return the issue of abortion back to the people and their elected representatives. The promise of Dobbs cannot be fulfilled if chemical abortion drugs can be mailed to all 50 states, despite what those elected representatives in those states and their people wanted to do to protect their women and children. If they cannot stop those drugs from coming within their borders because the FDA has promoted, pushed, and approved mail-order chemical abortions, then the promise of Dobbs can never be fulfilled. And that's a message we've sent to the Supreme Court, and our allies are doing the same thing, because maybe the court's asking, not another abortion-related case, we just decided Dobbs. Like, why so soon? Why this issue? Well, this issue is imperative if the promise of Dobbs is going to be fulfilled and followed through with at the state level at least.
Congressman, if you would.
I'll make one more additional political observation for those who are wringing their hands and fearful after the election, at least in my Commonwealth, my home state of Virginia. And I just want to break it down for you very, very practically here. In Virginia, after redistricting that took place, the Supreme Court of Virginia did the redistricting a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago now, I guess, but it got in place a year ago. It greatly diminished the number of competitive House and Senate districts in Virginia. So there's 100 House districts in the General Assembly, and 89 of those are not competitive, meaning they're either 70% blue or 70% red districts, where either Trump and Youngkin won it by 70%, or Biden and McAuliffe won it by 70%, and a chimpanzee or Mickey Mouse could run, and they're going to win with an ROD depending on the district. So that left 11 competitive House districts. We did win 7 out of the 11, but we had to win 10 out of 11 to get the majority. We could and should have done better, and I would submit that we did not inspire and motivate our base because we were too moderate. And the Senate was even more determinative. It was 20 to 16. I mean, there's 40 Senate seats. 20 of those are deep blue 70% seats. 16 are deep red seats. There's 4 competitive seats. So you can do the math real quick. We had to win all 4 in order to have Winsome Sears, Lieutenant Governor, be able to break the tie, and we won 3 out of 4. So we didn't quite hit our goal of winning all 4. But the most pro-choice of the 4 Republicans lost. The most pro-life of those Republicans won in those competitive districts. So for all those hand-wringing and we got to move away from abortion, first of all, that would be morally wrong, but it also, I don't believe it's the political answer, even if it were. I don't believe it is the political answer, because we're right on every other issue, and we need to be bold and unapologetic on this issue as well.
House Freedom Caucus member and Virginia Republican Bob Good speaking at the Heritage Foundation. You can see all of that event at cspan.org. Finally, tonight, episode 9 of our series, Books That Shaped America. In partnership with the Library of Congress, we're exploring 10 books from American literature that provoked thought, won awards, led to significant societal changes, and are still talked about today. Tonight, Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. The 1980 bestseller was based on the PBS miniseries of the same name. It strongly argues for free trade, lower taxes, limited government regulation, and school choice. Milton Friedman won the 1976 Nobel Prize for Economics. He was an advisor to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan, who gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1988. Books That Shaped America, featuring Free to Choose, starts live at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. You can listen to it here on C-SPAN Radio and watch it on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now. That's our free mobile video app, or online at cspan.org. And in our companion podcast that's out now, Milton Friedman's friend, Chapman University professor Mark Skousen, talked about the global leaders who were Milton Friedman's biggest admirers.
Well, certainly Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were big fans of Friedman, and also Friedrich Hayek of the Austrian school as well, both titans in the free market, giants in the land, so to speak, of free market economics. But he also had tremendous influence in not only the Reagan administration and Thatcher across the pond, but also came and spoke in China, went to Hong Kong and used Hong Kong as an example in his Free to Choose a series of the best example of free market economics. He would be rolling over in his grave right now, seeing what is happening with China taking back Hong Kong prematurely, violating the agreements and so forth. So, political freedom was really important to Friedman, and he thought you needed both economic and political freedom. He was very much instrumental in creating the Economic Freedom Index that the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation have created. And this has universal interest because every nation is ranked on how much economic freedom they have. And studies have shown that countries that have the highest level of economic freedom grow the fastest, and growth is absolutely essential to a prosperous and democratic country. So we need economic growth. He would be very disappointed in the slow growth that we're seeing all around the world, mainly because government has become more intrusive. This is a constant battle that Friedman fought and thought he had won with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet central planning model, but it's a constant battle, that's for sure.
Chapman University professor Mark Skousen on our Books That Shaped America companion podcast. You can get it by scanning the QR code at the bottom of the screen on tonight's show. You can also find it at cspan.org/podcasts and on the podcast tab of the C-SPAN Now free mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. It's also on YouTube. Just search Washington Today. And for more on the stories that are shaping Washington every day, get our free daily email word for word. You can go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe to that. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.